Welcome to Saga Dream Tales, the place where you can relax, unwind, and drift into calm stories shaped by ancient world. Here, every tale moves slowly, carried by soft words and peaceful rhythm, made to ease your mind and guide you into a quiet space. In today's journey, we follow Freya as she wanders through the 9 realms, where golden fields meet eternal halls, and gentle magic flows through all living things. Her path is soft, endless, and filled with the quiet beauty of the old northern land. All you need to do now is sit back, breathe deeply, and let the story unfold at its own slow pace. Close your eyes if you wish, let your body settle into comfort, and allow yourself to be carried away to a time when goddesses walked among wildflowers and every growing thing held sacred purpose. The journey begins now. In the time before time was counted, when the world was young, and the mountains still remembered their birth from the sea, there lived a goddess whose beauty matched the first light of dawn. Her name was Freya, and she belonged to an ancient clan of gods called the Vanir. These were the gods of growing things, of harvest and plenty, of the gentle rains that fed the earth, and the warm sun that coaxed seeds from sleep. Freya moved through the realms with grace that made the wind pause, and the rivers slow their rushing. Her hair caught the colors of sunset, flowing in waves of gold and amber that seemed to hold light within each strand. When she walked through meadows, flowers turned their faces toward her. When she passed through forests, the trees bent their branches in greeting. She carried with her the scent of spring blossoms and summer honey, and her presence brought peace to troubled heart. The goddess made her home in a hall called Sesramnia, which meant the seat of many rooms. This hall stood in the realm of Folkvanga, the field of the people, where half of those who died in battle came to rest. But this was not a place of war or sadness. Instead, it was a realm of eternal peace, where the fallen warriors laid down their weapons and learned the ways of growing things. They tended gardens that never failed, and they sang songs that had no words, only the pure feeling of contentment. The hall itself was vast beyond measure, with rooms that seemed to multiply as more souls arrived seeking peace. Its walls were made of golden wood that glowed softly in all lights, whether day or night. The roof was thatched with grass that stayed forever green, and from its edges hung flowers that bloomed in all seasons at once. Inside, the floors were smooth and warm beneath bare feet. Tapestries covered the walls, showing scenes of fields in harvest time, of rivers flowing through peaceful valleys, of families gathered around fires in winter. Freya spent her days moving between the worlds, but she was not content to remain in one place. Her heart was too large, and her curiosity too great. She wished to know all things, to understand all sorrows, and to bring comfort where comfort was needed. She had a cloak made of falcon feathers, a gift from the ancient magic of her people. When she wrapped this cloak around her shoulders, she could take the form of a bird and fly swift as thought across the 9 worlds. In her bird form, Freya would soar above the realm of Midgard, the Middle Earth where humans made their lives. She watched them plant their fields in spring, breaking the dark soil with wooden plows pulled by patient oxen. She saw them scatter seeds with practiced hands, trusting that the earth would remember its part of the ancient bargain. She observed as they waited through the long growing season, tending their crops with care, pulling weeds, and watching the sky for rain. When harvest time came, Freya flew low over the golden fields. She saw the humans gathering grain with sickles, bundling the stalks and setting them to dry. She heard their songs of thanksgiving, simple melodies that rose into the clear autumn air. These songs pleased her greatly, for they showed that humans understood the gifts of the earth and did not take them without gratitude. Sometimes, when the songs were particularly beautiful, Freya would land in her bird form on a fence post and listen until the last note faded. The goddess had 2 daughters, though they were often away on their own journeys. Their names were Nos and Gusemi, and both had inherited their mother's beauty and gentle nature. Nos meant treasure, for she was precious beyond gold. Gusemi meant jewel, for she sparkled like the finest gem. When they were young, Freya had taught them the ways of growing things. She showed them how to speak with plants, how to understand the language of wind and water, how to sense where the earth was tired and needed rest. The daughters would accompany their mother on her travels sometimes. Together, they would visit the farms and villages of Midgard, unseen by human eyes. They would bless the fields with their presence, and wherever they walked, the soil grew more fertile. The crops that grew in their footsteps were always the healthiest, the grain the heaviest, the vegetables the sweetest. Farmers would wonder at these fortunate patches of land, never knowing that goddesses had passed through in the night. Freya possessed a necklace called Brisingamen, the necklace of the Brising. It was the most beautiful thing ever crafted, made by 4 dwarf brothers who worked in the deep places beneath the mountains. The necklace was forged from gold that seemed alive with inner fire. It caught every shade of light and transformed it into something more beautiful. When Freya wore the necklace, which was always, it rested against her throat and chest, warm as summer sunlight on bare skin. The making of this necklace had required great sacrifice from Freya, for the dwarves had asked a high price for their work. But she had paid it willingly, understanding that some beautiful things require us to give something of ourselves in return. Now the necklace was part of her, as much as her golden hair or her kind eyes. It enhanced her power over growing things and deepened her connection to the earth and all its creatures. The goddess had another treasure, a boar named Hildisvini, whose name meant battle swine. But despite his fierce name, he was a gentle creature. His bristles were made of gold that never tarnished, and his eyes held ancient wisdom. Hildisvini could run faster than the swiftest horse, his golden hooves barely touching the ground as he moved. He could cross between the worlds as easily as crossing a stream, and he served as Freya's mount when she wished to travel in her own form rather than as a bird. Sometimes Freya would ride Hildisvini through the forests that covered much of the northern lands. These were ancient woods, where trees grew so tall their tops disappeared into mist, where moss covered every surface in shades of green that had no names. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves from 1,000 autumns. Mushrooms grew in fairy rings, and ferns uncurled their fronds in shadowed glens. As Freya rode through these forests, the animals would gather to watch her pass. Deer would step from behind trees, their large eyes watching without fear. Rabbits would pause in their feeding, noses twitching. Birds would settle on branches overhead, their songs becoming softer and sweeter. Even the shy creatures, the foxes and badgers who avoided all other beings, would emerge from their dens to catch a glimpse of the goddess passing by. Freya knew each animal by name, though not names made of words. She knew them by their essence, by the particular way their spirit expressed itself in the world. She could sense when a doe was about to give birth, and she would send her blessing to ensure the fawn arrived safely. She knew when a bird had lost its mate, and she would comfort it with her presence. She understood the language of wolves howling in the distance, and she knew they sang not of hunger or violence, but of family and belonging. The goddess had learned magic from her people, the Vanir, who were masters of a particular kind of sorcery. This magic was called Sidra, and it involved seeing the threads of fate and possibility that connected all things. With Sidra, one could look into the future and see what might come to pass. One could also look into the past and understand how the present had come to be. Most powerfully, one could sometimes pull on these threads and change the pattern, altering fate itself. Freya had become so skilled in Sidra that she could teach it to others, even to the gods of Asgard, the mighty Aesir, who were more accustomed to swords and direct action than to subtle magic. She had taught the Allfather himself, the one-eyed wanderer who sought wisdom above all things. In return, he had shared his own knowledge with her, and so the 2 clans of gods, Vanir and Aesir, had grown closer through this exchange of gifts. In the practice of Sidra, Freya would enter a state between waking and sleeping. She would sit upon a high seat, a platform that raised her above the ground, symbolizing her position between earth and sky. Around her, other practitioners would sing, their voices creating a rhythm that helped carry her consciousness away from the ordinary world. In this altered state, Freya could see the web of word, the network of cause and effect that bound all things together. The web appeared to her inner vision like threads of light, some bright and strong, others dim and fragile. Each thread represented a connection between beings, between events, between possibilities. Where many threads came together, a node would form, glowing brighter than the rest. These nodes were moments of great importance, times when many fates hinged on a single decision or action. Freya could follow these threads backward into the past, seeing how present situations had been shaped by ancient choices. She could see how a kind word spoken long ago had led to a friendship that had saved a life, that had allowed a child to be born, who would grow up to change the fate of nations. She could see how a moment of anger, forgotten by those who experienced it, had sent ripples forward through time, creating patterns of hurt that lasted generations. But Freya used her sight most often to help, rather than simply to know. When she saw threads that led towards sorrow or suffering, she would sometimes intervene. She could not change fate entirely, for even gods must respect the deep patterns woven by the Norns, the three sisters who controlled all destiny. But she could often nudge events in gentler directions, open paths that had been closed, or close paths that led to unnecessary pain. Sometimes Freya would visit the homes of humans in the deep night, when all were sleeping. She would stand beside the beds of those who were troubled, those who tossed and turned with worry or grief. With her magic, she could enter their dreams, transforming nightmares into peaceful scenes. A person dreaming of falling might suddenly find themselves floating gently down to land in a field of soft grass. A person dreaming of being chased might dream instead that they were running for joy, racing the wind just to feel the freedom of movement. In these dreams, Freya would sometimes appear as herself, though the dreamers would not remember her face upon waking. They would remember only a sense of being loved, of being protected, of being valued beyond measure. This feeling would stay with them through the following day, giving them strength to face their troubles. Many people made it through difficult times solely because of the comfort Freya brought them in sleep, though they never knew her name or guessed that a goddess had walked through their dreams. The goddess also visited women in childbirth, standing invisible beside them as they labored to bring new life into the world. She could not take away the pain, for birth was a threshold that required effort to cross. But she could give courage. She could remind the laboring mother of her strength. She could show her visions of the child she was about to meet, filling her with love for the tiny person who was fighting just as hard to be born. When the child finally arrived, slippery and squalling, Freya would bless it with a touch that no one could see. She would look at the infant's fate threads and see what possibilities lay ahead. If she saw threads leading toward kindness and growth, she would strengthen them. If she saw threads leading toward cruelty or waste, she would try to weaken them, making it easier for the child to choose better paths as they grew. Freya understood that every soul had the potential for both light and shadow. She did not judge harshly those who made poor choices, for she could see all the circumstances that had led to those moments. She saw how hurt people hurt others, how fear made people cruel, how shame made people hide and lie. She saw all of this and felt compassion rather than anger. But she also worked tirelessly to create conditions that would help people choose light over shadow. She blessed crops so that hunger would not drive people to theft and violence. She comforted the sorrowful so that their pain would not turn to bitterness. She brought peaceful dreams so that rest would restore people's capacity for kindness. In all things, she acted with love as her guide. The goddess had a special love for growing things, for the patient process of seeds becoming plants, of plants bearing fruit, of fruit feeding the creatures of the world. She would often take her time walking through wild places, observing how life sustained itself in the absence of human hand. She watched how trees shared nutrients through their roots, how older trees would feed younger ones that grew in their shade. She saw how dead trees became homes for insects and fungi, which in turn fed birds and small mammals. In these observations, Freya saw the great truth that all life was connected, that nothing existed in isolation. The health of the forest depended on every part playing its role. The mighty oak and the humble moss were equally important. The wolf who hunted deer kept the herd strong and prevented overgrazing. The beetles who ate dead wood returned its nutrients to the soil for new growth. Every being had purpose. Every life had value. This understanding made Freya gentle in all her dealings. She never crushed an insect beneath her foot without good reason. She never broke a plant without giving thanks. When she needed herbs for her magic, she would ask permission before harvesting, and she would always leave enough for the plant to recover and continue growing. She taught this practice to her daughters, and through them, to the wise women and healers who served in her name. In the realm of Midgard, these wise women kept Freya's traditions alive. They learned which plants could heal and which could harm. They learned when to harvest, when the moon made medicines most potent. They learned songs to sing while working, songs that thanked the plants and asked them to lend their strength to healing. These women became the bridge between the divine and the human, carrying the goddess's gifts to those who needed them. Freya would visit these wise women in their dreams, teaching them new remedies, warning them of coming illnesses, guiding their hands when they worked. A healer might wake with sudden knowledge of how to treat a disease she had never seen before. And she would understand that the knowledge was a gift from the goddess. The healer would use this knowledge to save lives, and in saving lives, she honored Freya better than any sacrifice or temple could. The goddess also loved the arts of making and creating. She appreciated the work of skilled hands, shaping raw materials into objects of beauty and function. She would watch smiths at their forges, hammering red-hot iron into tools and weapons. She would observe weavers at their looms, creating cloth from simple thread. She would stand invisible beside potters as they shaped clay on spinning wheels, their hands wet and muddy but sure in their movement. In each craft, Freya saw another form of magic, the magic of transformation, of taking what the earth provided and making it into something new. She saw how human creativity echoed the creativity of the gods, how making things was a way of participating in the ongoing creation of the world. She blessed the hands of craftspeople, giving them skill and inspiration, helping them see the hidden form within the raw material. Sometimes Freya would inspire a craftsperson with a vision of something new, something that had never been made before. A weaver might suddenly imagine a new pattern, more beautiful than any she had seen. A smith might dream of a tool that would make work easier for those who used it. A potter might see in his mind a vessel of such perfect form that it seemed to contain poetry. These inspired makers would wake and rush to their work, driven to manifest the vision before it faded. The objects created through such inspiration carried a touch of the divine. They worked better than ordinary tools. They lasted longer. They brought joy to those who owned them. A cloak woven with Freya's inspiration would keep its wearer warmer than any other garment. A blade forged with her blessing would hold its edge through years of use. A bowl shaped with her guidance would make food taste better and never chip or crack. But Freya cared even more for the creator than for the creation. She knew that the act of making was itself a gift, that the satisfaction of skilled work was its own reward. When a craftsperson lost themselves in their work, time disappearing as their hands moved with practiced ease, they touched the same state of being that Freya herself experienced when working her magic. In those moments, human and divine were not so different. The goddess traveled often to the seashore, for she loved the meeting place of land and water. She would walk along beaches where waves rolled in with eternal rhythm, their sound a form of meditation older than thought. She would watch the tide come in, covering rocks and sand, and then retreat, revealing treasures that had been hidden. She saw in this rhythm a reflection of life itself, the constant flow of giving and receiving, advancing and retreating, holding on and letting go. On these beaches, Freya would gather beautiful stones worn smooth by countless waves. She would hold each stone and feel its history, sensing how long it had tumbled in the surf to achieve its perfect roundness. Some stones were dark as night, others pale as cream. Some had veins of color running through them like frozen lightning. Each was unique, each was beautiful in its own way. The goddess would sometimes give these stones as gifts, though those who received them rarely knew where they had truly come from. A child walking on the beach might find a stone of unusual beauty lying in her path, placed there by invisible hand. She would pick it up and carry it home, treasuring it for reasons she could not explain. Years later, in moments of difficulty, she might hold that stone and feel an inexplicable sense of comfort, never knowing that she held a gift from a goddess. Freya also loved to watch the seabirds that made their homes along the coast. Gulls wheeled and cried in the salt air, their white wings bright against storm-gray skies. Hens dove for fish with astonishing precision, disappearing beneath the waves and emerging with silver minnows in their beaks. Puffins nested in cliffside burrows, their colorful beaks making them look like small clowns of the sea. Each bird lived according to its nature, asking no questions about purpose or meaning. They simply were, and in their being, they were perfect. The gull did not wish to be a tern. The tern did not envy the puffin. Each followed its own path, content in its own life. Freya saw in this a lesson for all conscious beings. To be fully yourself, to live according to your own nature without apology or pretense, this was a form of wisdom. The goddess would sometimes take her falcon feather cloak and join the seabirds in their flight. As a falcon, she could soar on the wind currents rising from the cliffs, barely moving her wings, held aloft by the invisible power of air flowing upward. She could dive at speeds that made the world blur, pulling up at the last moment to skim the wave tops. She could feel what it was to have wings, to be built for flight, to experience the world from the perspective of the sky. In these moments of flight, Freya felt a freedom that even gods rarely experience. All her responsibilities fell away. She was not a goddess with duties to fulfill. She was not a mother with daughters to guide. She was not a teacher with wisdom to share. She was simply a bird riding the wind, existing purely in the moment, aware only of air and light and the joy of movement. But always, after a time, she would return to her own form. She would land on some isolated beach or windswept cliff, and the falcon feathers would become a cloak once more, draping from her shoulders. She would stand in her divine shape, beautiful and terrible and kind all at once, and remember who she was and why she walked between the worlds. Freya knew that even gods needed moments of forgetting, times when the weight of immortality could be set aside. She understood that carrying awareness of all times and all places could be a burden as much as a gift. So she gave herself these moments of pure experience, these flights where nothing existed but wind and wing, and she returned from them refreshed, ready again to bear the responsibilities of her nature. The goddess had seen many ages pass since the world was young. She had watched mountains rise and wear away. She had seen forests grow where once there had been only bare rock, and deserts form where forests had stood. She had watched species of animals come and go, appearing for their appointed time, and then fading back into the great mystery from which all life emerged. Through all these changes, Freya remained constant in her care for the living. Each new form of life that appeared was precious to her. Each creature that went extinct was mourned, though she understood that change was the nature of existence. Nothing lasted forever in its current form. Not mountains, not forests, not even gods. All things transformed, and transformation was neither good nor bad. It simply was. Sometimes Freya would visit the Well of Erd, where the three Norns dwelled and tended the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. This well was a source of water so pure and powerful that it sustained the great ash tree that held all 9 worlds in its branches and roots. The Norns, whose names were Erd, Verdandi, and Skuld, represented the past, the present, and the future. They wove the fates of all beings, from the smallest insect to the mightiest god. When Freya came to the well, the Norns would pause in their weaving to greet her. They spoke little, for they lived in a place beyond words, but their welcome was warm. Freya would sit beside the well and look into its depths, seeing visions of what had been and what might yet be. She would see the threads of countless lives, see how they wove together in patterns of almost unbearable complexity and beauty. Sometimes, looking into the well, Freya would weep. She would weep for the sorrows that had been, and the sorrows that were yet to come. She would weep for choices that led to suffering, for love that turned to loss, for beauty that faded, for joy that ended. But she would also weep from overwhelming feeling at the courage she witnessed, at the small kindnesses that changed everything, at the love that persisted despite all odds, at the laughter that arose in the darkest time. The Norns would sit with her in silence, offering no comfort beyond their presence. They understood her tears. They themselves wove threads that led to both joy and sorrow, for such was the nature of life. One could not have light without shadow, could not have growth without struggle, could not have love without the risk of loss. To live was to accept all of this, and even gods were not exempt from life's fundamental terms. After her tears had passed, Freya would drink from the well. The water was cold and sweet beyond description, and it restored her spirit. She would leave offerings at the well, drops of honey, fragments of bread, strands of her golden hair. Then she would depart, flying back to her own realm, carrying with her a renewed sense of purpose. In her hall of Sessrumnir, Freya welcomed those who came to her after death. Unlike the warriors who went to Odin's hall of Valhalla to feast and fight, those who came to Freya's hall came to rest and heal. They were people who had carried great sorrows in life, who had endured much and remained kind despite it. They were people who had loved deeply and lost greatly. They were people who needed gentleness after a hard life. When these souls first arrived, they were often tired beyond measure. The burdens they had carried in life still weighed upon them, even though they no longer had physical bodies to be weary. They moved slowly, uncertainly, like people waking from a long and troubled sleep. They did not immediately understand that they were safe, that their struggles were over, that they could finally rest. Freya would greet each one personally. She would speak their name, the true name of their spirit, not necessarily the name they had been called in life. She would look into their eyes and see them fully, all they had been and all they had done. She would acknowledge their pain and honor their endurance, and then she would invite them to rest. In the many rooms of Sessrumnir, each soul found a space that was perfectly suited to their need. Some found rooms with windows looking out over endless peaceful fields. Others found rooms with views of mountains or forests or the sea. Still others found rooms that looked inward to gardens where it was always twilight, where gentle rain fell on flowers that grew in soil mixed with starlight. Each soul could rest as long as needed. Some slept for what seemed like years, making up for all the sleep they had lost to worry and sorrow in life. Others wandered the fields of Folkvanger, relearning how to exist without fear or pain. They would touch flowers and be amazed that nothing hurt. They would lie in grass and realize they were not too tired to enjoy it. They would watch clouds drift across endless sky and understand that they had all the time in the world, that there was nowhere they needed to be, nothing they needed to do. Gradually, these souls would heal. The lines of pain would fade from them. The heaviness would lift. They would begin to smile more easily, to laugh at small things, to take joy in simple pleasures. They would make friends with other souls in the hall, sharing stories of their lives, finding comfort in knowing they were not alone in what they had endured. Freya would watch this process with satisfaction. This was her gift to those who came to her, this chance to heal, to be whole again, to remember what it felt like to be at peace. She asked nothing in return. Their healing was its own reward, and seeing joy return to those who had suffered was more precious to her than any treasure. Some souls eventually chose to be reborn, to return to the cycle of life and try again with the wisdom they had gained. Others chose to remain in Folkvanger, becoming helpers in their turn, welcoming new arrivals and offering comfort from their own experience. Still others simply rested, content to exist in peace, asking nothing more from eternity than to be free from suffering. Freya honored all these choices. She believed in the freedom of each soul to choose its own path. She would not force anyone to be reborn who wished to rest, nor would she prevent anyone from resting who wished to try life again. Her hall was a place of healing, not a prison, and those who came to her were free to come and go as they pleased. The goddess had one sorrow that never fully healed, though she bore it with grace. Her husband, whose name was Odd, had left long ago on a journey from which he had never returned. She had searched for him across all the 9 worlds, weeping tears of gold that fell to earth and became precious metal wherever they landed. But she had never found him, and eventually she had accepted that some mysteries have no answers, some losses are permanent. This sorrow had made Freya more compassionate, not less. She understood the pain of loving someone and not knowing their fate. She understood the waiting that never ends, the hope that refuses to die even in the face of all reason. She understood what it meant to keep living and loving despite a wound that never fully closed. And this understanding made her especially gentle with those who came to her bearing similar griefs. When someone arrived in Sessrumnir carrying the pain of a love lost, of a person disappeared, of questions that could never be answered, Freya would sit with them in special tenderness. She would not say that she understood their pain, though she did. She would not tell them it would get better, though it would. She would simply sit with them in silence, holding space for their grief, letting them feel what they needed to feel without judgment or advice. In time, these souls would find their own way to peace. Some would come to accept that not knowing was itself an answer, that uncertainty was a state they could learn to inhabit. Others would create stories to fill the empty spaces, narratives that brought them comfort, even if they could never be verified. Still others would simply let the questions go, deciding that the not knowing mattered less than the love they still carried. Freya saw in all of this the great courage of conscious being. It took courage to love knowing that love could be lost. It took courage to keep living when life had taken something irreplaceable. It took courage to find meaning in a world that did not always make sense. And she honored that courage wherever she found it, in gods and humans, and all beings in between. The goddess also walked in the realm of Jotunheim, the land of giants, though she went there less often than to other worlds. The giants were beings of tremendous power, and often of terrible tempers. They represented the raw forces of nature, the chaos that existed before order, the wild that resisted taming. Many gods feared the giants or fought against them. But Freya saw in them another aspect of existence that deserved respect. In Jotunheim, mountains were higher and storms more fierce. Rivers ran wild and forests were dark and deep beyond human imagining. Everything was larger than life, more intense, more extreme. It was a land of absolutes, of winter so cold it could freeze thought and summer so hot it could melt stone. It was beautiful in its extremity, terrible in its power. Freya would walk through this land in her most careful guise, showing respect to the giants she encountered. She knew their names and their lineages. She knew which ones were wise and which ones were foolish. She knew which ones could be reasoned with and which ones acted purely on instinct and appetite. She navigated their world with the same grace she brought to all her wanderings, neither fearful nor arrogant. Some giants respected Freya for her beauty and her power. They would let her pass unhindered, sometimes even offering hospitality. She would accept their offerings with gratitude, understanding that in the giants' culture, refusing hospitality was a grave insult. She would eat their food and drink their mead, though portions meant for giants were overwhelming to one of her size. She would listen to their stories, which often lasted for days, and she would share her own knowledge in return. Other giants saw in Freya only something they desired to possess. These were the dangerous ones, the ones who saw beauty as something to capture rather than to admire from a respectful distance. With these giants, Freya had to be clever. She would use her magic to confuse them, to make herself appear to be somewhere she was not, to slip away when they thought they had cornered her. She never used violence if she could avoid it, preferring trickery and evasion. Through her wanderings in Jotunheim, Freya came to understand the giants better than most other gods. She saw that beneath their fearsome appearances and violent tendencies, many giants carried their own sorrows and yearnings. They too loved and lost. They too dreamed of beauty and peace. They too grew weary of conflict and wished for rest. They were not so different from other beings, only larger and more dangerous in their unhappiness. This understanding made Freya a bridge between worlds in more ways than one. When conflicts arose between the gods and giants, she could sometimes negotiate peace where others would have reached for weapon. She could speak to the giants in ways they understood, offering them things they valued, helping them feel respected rather than threatened. She saved many lives on both sides through her diplomacy, though few beyond the principles involved ever knew it. The goddess also visited Alfheim, the realm of the light elves. This was a land of such beauty it almost hurt to behold. Everything in Alfheim seemed to be made of light and music and colors that existed nowhere else. The light elves themselves were beings of pure grace, immortal and lovely, and skilled in all art. They lived in harmony with their land, creating rather than consuming, adding beauty to beauty without end. When Freya walked in Alfheim, she felt a kinship with its people. Like her, they valued beauty and growing things. Like her, they understood magic as something natural rather than supernatural. Like her, they moved through the world with love as their guiding principle. She would spend long periods in Alfheim, sometimes forgetting to return to her other duties. So enchanted was she by the peace and beauty of that realm. The light elves would welcome Freya with celebrations that lasted for days. They would dance beneath trees that sang in the wind, their movements telling stories without words. They would create illusions of light that showed scenes from the history of the worlds, images so real that Freya could almost step into them. They would offer her food that seemed to be made of sunlight and morning dew, and it tasted like every good thing she had ever experienced. In return, Freya would share her knowledge of magic with the elves. Though they were skilled in their own forms of sorcery, they were always eager to learn new techniques. She would show them aspects of cedar they had not encountered before. She would teach them songs that could shape weather or heal sickness. She would demonstrate how to read the threads of fate and sometimes alter them. The elves would learn quickly, their immortal minds absorbing everything with perfect clarity. But more than teaching, Freya simply enjoyed being among beings who understood beauty the way she did. The elves appreciated subtlety in a way that many other beings did not. They could spend hours contemplating a single flower, noticing how the light changed its colors as the sun moved across the sky, how dew gathered in its petals at dawn, how it closed its face at night to rest. This kind of deep attention to beauty fed Freya's spirit in ways that nothing else could. When she finally tore herself away from Alfheim to return to her duties, Freya would always carry with her gifts from the elves. They would give her seeds of flowers that grew nowhere else, which she would plant in Folkvanga and tend with care. They would give her instruments that made music sweeter than any earthly sound. They would give her poems inscribed on leaves that never withered, verses of such beauty that reading them brought tears to even a goddess's eyes. The goddess also descended into the dark realm of Svartalfheim, where the dark elves, also called dwarves, made their homes deep beneath the mountains. This was a world of stone and metal, of forges that burned with eternal fires, of halls carved from solid rock and polished until they gleamed. Here in the darkness, the dwarves created objects of such skill and beauty that even the gods coveted their work. The dwarves were different from their light elf cousins in almost every way. Where light elves were tall and graceful, dwarves were short and sturdy. Where light elves worked with living things and light, dwarves mastered stone and metal. Where light elves lived in constant brightness, dwarves preferred the depths where no sunlight ever reached. Yet both peoples were skilled beyond measure, each in their own domain. Freya respected the dwarfs greatly, for she understood that beauty took many forms. The beauty of a perfectly forged sword was no less real than the beauty of a flower. The satisfaction of working metal until it achieved ideal form was no different from the satisfaction of coaxing a plant to bloom. All skill was sacred. All craft was prayer. The dwarfs knew this in their bones, and so Freya honored them. When she visited the dwarf halls, Freya would bring gifts appropriate to their culture. She would bring rare metals from the surface world, or gems found in riverbeds where water had tumbled them smooth. She would bring news of the upper worlds, for dwarves spent so much time in their forges and workshops that they sometimes forgot the existence of sky and sun. She would bring songs from other lands, and the dwarves would listen with unexpected appreciation, their gruff exteriors hiding souls that yearned for beauty, just like any other beings. In return, the dwarves would show Freya their greatest work. They would take her through galleries, where weapons hung on walls, each blade perfect in balance and edge. They would show her jewelry that captured light in impossible ways, making it dance and multiply until one candle flame became 1,000 stars. They would demonstrate armor so cunningly made that it weighed almost nothing but could turn aside any blow. Freya would admire each piece with genuine wonder. She could see the hours of work in every object, the patience required to achieve such perfection. She could sense the care with which each piece had been made, the pride the maker took in their work. She understood that these objects were not merely things but expressions of the souls who had created them. In admiring the work, she honored the worker. The dwarves appreciated this about Freya. Many other gods visited, seeking only to acquire dwarf-made treasures for themselves. They would make demands, offer inadequate payment, sometimes even try to steal what they could not purchase. But Freya came as a friend. She asked rather than demanded. She paid fairly for what she wanted. She never tried to rush the dwarves or make them compromise their standards. And so the dwarves counted her among the very few gods they truly trusted. It was the dwarves who had made her necklace. Rising Daemon. 4 brothers had worked together for months, pouring all their skill into creating something worthy of the goddess of beauty. They had argued over every detail, each brother insisting his vision was better. But in the end, they had created something greater than any of them could have made alone. The necklace was their masterpiece, and seeing Freya wear it brought them satisfaction beyond any payment. The goddess would sometimes bring problems to the dwarves, challenges that required their unique skills to solve. A farmer's tools might be wearing out faster than they should, and the farmer was too poor to afford new ones. Freya would commission dwarf-made tools as a gift, tools that would last the farmer's lifetime and his children's lifetimes after. A midwife might need a special knife for her work, something sharp enough to cut cleanly but safe enough to use near newborn. Freya would describe what was needed, and the dwarves would create it. These small commissions pleased the dwarves more than making weapons for kings or jewelry for noble. They liked being useful. They liked knowing their work would help someone struggling to make a living from the earth. They liked the idea that their craft could ease someone's burden. And so they would often refuse payment for these items, telling Freya that her friendship was payment enough. She would accept this with grace, knowing that to insist on paying would insult them. Between her visits to the various realms, Freya would return to her own hall in Folkvanger. She would walk through the fields where the fallen warriors tended their gardens. She would stop to admire their work, praising a particularly fine stand of wheat or a vegetable garden bursting with produce. She would offer advice when asked, suggesting which plants grew well together, which needed more sun or shade, how to manage pests without causing harm. The warriors had learned much in their time in Folkvanger. Men who had known only fighting in life now understood the satisfaction of coaxing food from soil. They learned patience as they waited for seeds to sprout and grow. They learned gentleness as they handled tender young plants. They learned the rhythms of the seasons, how each had its own work and its own gifts. They learned that strength could be used to nurture, as well as to destroy. Many of these warriors would tell Freya that they wished they had known these things in life. They wished they had spent more time with their families, helping with the planting and harvest. They wished they had appreciated the work their wives and mothers did to keep everyone fed. They wished they had understood that growing food was as important as defending it, that creation was as valuable as protection. Freya would listen to these regrets with compassion, but she would gently remind them that they could not change the past. What mattered now was what they chose to do with eternity. Would they carry their regrets like chains, or would they let them become lessons? Would they remain forever the warriors they had been, or would they allow themselves to become something new? Most chose growth, and Freya was glad. In the evenings, when the light grew long and golden across the fields, Freya would often sit outside her hall and sing. Her voice was beautiful beyond description, carrying tones that seemed to harmonize with themselves, creating music that was both simple and impossibly complex. She sang without words, letting pure sound express what language could not capture. She sang of love and loss, of beauty and sorrow, of the endless cycle of life and death and rebirth. Those who heard her singing would stop whatever they were doing and simply listen. The sound would wash over them like warm rain, soaking into places in their souls they had forgotten existed. Old pains would soften. Old joys would stir and wait. For the duration of the song, everything felt right with the world, as if there was a pattern to existence after all, a meaning that made sense of all the confusion and suffering. When the song ended, silence would settle over Folkvanger like a blessing. No one would speak for a long time. They would all remain still, holding on to the feeling the song had created, knowing it would fade, but wanting to preserve it as long as possible. Eventually someone would sigh, and someone else would move, and gradually everyone would return to their activities. But they would carry something of the song with them, a reminder that beauty existed and could be touched, if only for a moment. Freya understood the power of beauty to heal and transform. She knew that a single moment of experiencing something truly beautiful could change a person's entire outlook. It could remind them why life was worth living. It could give them strength to endure hardship. It could open their hearts when they had grown too defended, too closed off from feeling. Beauty was not frivolous or decorative. It was essential to the health of the soul. This was why Freya worked so tirelessly to bring beauty into the world. This was why she blessed the fields and gardens, why she inspired craftspeople, why she brought peaceful dreams to the suffering. Every act of beauty-making was an act of healing. Every moment of genuine appreciation was a prayer. The world needed beauty, the way it needed air and water, and Freya was devoted to ensuring that need was met. The goddess also understood that beauty alone was not enough. There must also be justice, fairness, the willingness to help those who struggled. Freya used her magic and her influence to advocate for the powerless. When she saw humans or other beings suffering under cruelty or oppression, she would intervene in subtle ways. She could not simply solve all problems with divine power, for that would rob people of their own agency and growth. But she could create opportunities, open doors, plant ideas. A cruel leader might find himself suddenly stricken with a disease that forced him to face his own mortality and reconsider his choices. A wealthy person hoarding resources might dream night after night of the suffering their greed caused, until conscience finally moved them to generosity. A community torn by conflict might find an unexpected mediator appearing among them, someone with the wisdom to help them find common ground. In all of these situations, Freya's hand might be at work, though few would ever guess it. The goddess also worked to protect those who were most vulnerable in the world. Children without parents, elderly without family, people whose minds did not work the way most minds worked, those whose bodies were different or disabled. She watched over all of them with special care. She would arrange for helpers to cross their paths, for communities to welcome them, for their basic needs to be met. She could not prevent all suffering, but she could reduce it, and she dedicated herself to that work. Sometimes Freya would take mortal form and walk among humans as one of them. She would appear as an old woman seeking shelter for the night, testing whether people would show kindness to someone who appeared to have nothing to offer in return. Those who welcomed her would later find unexpected blessings come their way. Sick animals would recover. Failing crops would suddenly thrive. Long-standing conflicts would resolve themselves peacefully. They would never connect these blessings to the old woman they had sheltered, but Freya would remember their kindness. Other times she would appear as a young woman in need of help, seeing who would assist someone vulnerable. She would seem to be lost, or injured, or carrying too heavy a burden. Those who stopped to help, even when it was inconvenient, even when they had problems of their own, would earn her favor. She would bless them with her gifts, though they would never know why fortune smiled on them. She believed that goodness should be rewarded, that kindness should be recognized, even if those who practiced it never sought recognition. In her travels, Freya saw the best and worst of all beings. She saw breathtaking courage and heartbreaking cowardice. She saw selfless love and selfish cruelty. She saw people rise above their worst impulses, and people sink below their better nature. She saw all of this without judgment, understanding that every soul was on its own journey, learning its own lessons at its own pace. But she also never excused cruelty or accepted that harm was inevitable. She believed that all beings could choose to be better, to act with more kindness, to cause less suffering. She believed that circumstances might explain bad behavior, but did not justify it. And she believed that those who had power, whether divine or mortal, had a responsibility to use that power to protect and nurture, not to dominate and exploit. These beliefs guided all of Freya's actions. When she intervened in the affairs of the worlds, it was always in service of these principles. When she taught her magic to others, she emphasized the ethical use of power. When she welcomed souls to her hall, she helped them understand how their choices had affected others. She was not harsh in her teaching, but she was clear. Love was the highest principle, and all other virtues flowed from it. The goddess had lived for uncounted ages, and she would live for uncounted ages more. She had seen the world change in ways both wonderful and terrible. She had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of species, the slow transformation of the land itself. Through it all, she had remained constant in her essential nature, while also growing and learning and changing in her understanding. Freya knew that even gods were not static beings. She was not the same goddess she had been when the world was young. Experience had shaped her, suffering had deepened her compassion, joy had expanded her capacity for love. She had made mistakes and learned from them. She had been hurt and had healed. She had lost much and had found new things to cherish. She was, in her own way, always becoming more fully herself. This process of constant growth and change was something Freya encouraged in all beings. She did not believe that anyone should remain forever as they were. Growth was natural. Change was inevitable. The question was not whether one would change, but how one would change. Would you become more bitter or more compassionate? Would you close your heart or open it further? Would you use your pain as an excuse for cruelty or as motivation for kindness? These were the choices that defined a soul, and Freya honored the difficulty of making them. It was not easy to remain kind in a world that often rewarded cruelty. It was not easy to stay open when openness led to hurt. It was not easy to keep loving when love had been betrayed. But those who managed to do these things, who chose light even when darkness seemed easier, these were the ones Freya most admired. In the quiet moments between her duties and travels, Freya would sometimes simply sit and exist. She would find a peaceful place, perhaps a hillside overlooking fields, perhaps a grove of ancient trees, perhaps a spot beside a stream. She would sit without agenda, without purpose beyond being present. She would let her awareness expand until she could sense all the life around her, every plant and animal and insect, all of them going about their existence in their own particular ways. In these moments of deep presence, Freya would feel connected to everything. The boundaries between herself and the world would soften. She would feel the grass growing beneath her, slow and patient. She would feel the trees reaching toward sunlight, their patience measured in decades and centuries. She would feel the water moving in its eternal cycle, falling as rain, flowing in streams, rising as mist. She would feel the breath of all living things, in and out, the rhythm that connected all life. These were moments of perfect peace, perfect acceptance, perfect love. In them, Freya touched something beyond herself, something that was the source of all existence. Some called it the void, others called it the divine, still others had no name for it. Freya knew it simply as the ground of being, the reality beneath all appearances, the truth that remained when all illusions fell away. From this deep place, Freya would return to her individual consciousness, refreshed and renewed. She would remember that she was just one expression of this infinite creativity, one way that existence experienced itself. She was important and also unimportant. Her work mattered and also did not matter. Everything was both deeply meaningful and ultimately meaningless, and this paradox was something to embrace rather than resolve. The goddess would rise from her sitting and return to her hall, to her duties, to her endless care for the countless beings under her protection. She would greet souls arriving in Folkvanger. She would bless fields and inspire craftspeople. She would comfort the suffering and celebrate with the joyful. She would do all of this with presence and love, knowing that this too was sacred work, that caring for the world was how she expressed her deepest nature. And in the evenings, when the work was done for the day, Freya would sit once more outside her hall and sing. Her voice would rise into the darkening sky, carrying feelings too deep for words. The stars would emerge one by one, as if her song called them forth. The moon would rise, washing everything in silver light, and all the beings in Folkvanger would pause and listen, feeling themselves part of something vast and beautiful and infinitely kind. The song would continue as night deepened. It would weave through dreams, bringing comfort to all who slept. It would drift on the wind to other realms, touching hearts in worlds beyond counting. It would be heard by humans in Midgard, though they would think it was only the wind singing or the sound of their own hearts beating. It would reach the ears of the lost and lonely, giving them hope. It would embrace the dying, easing their transition. It would welcome the newly born, singing them into existence. This was Freya's gift to the worlds, this endless song of love and beauty and compassion. She asked nothing in return. She needed no worship or sacrifice, though she accepted what was freely given. She needed only to know that somewhere, someone was being helped by her presence. Somewhere, a field was more fertile because she had blessed it. Somewhere, a person slept more peacefully because she had eased their dreams. Somewhere, beauty existed where ugliness might have been. And so the goddess continued her eternal work, wandering between the worlds, bringing light to darkness, comfort to sorrow, hope to despair. She was endless in her patience, infinite in her compassion, constant in her love. She was Freya, goddess of beauty and magic, of growing things and gentle healing. She was the mother who welcomed the weary, the teacher who shared wisdom freely, the friend who never abandoned those who needed her. In the time beyond time, in the space between spaces, Freya walks still. She moves through the morning mist and the evening shadows. She touches the flowers opening to dawn and the stars emerging at dusk. She is in the laughter of children and the tears of the grieving. She is in every act of kindness, every moment of beauty, every choice to love rather than to fear. And her song continues, forever and always, weaving through all existence like a golden thread. It connects all beings to each other and to the source of all life. It reminds everyone who hears it, even without knowing they hear it, that they are loved, that they matter, that they are part of something infinitely precious. It tells them to rest, to heal, to let go of their burdens for a while. It promises them that morning will come, that spring follows winter, that light always returns after darkness. This is the gift of Freya, the blessing of the goddess. It is given freely to all, without condition or requirement. It is as constant as the turning of the seasons, as reliable as the sunrise, as gentle as rain falling on parched earth. It is love made manifest, compassion given form, beauty walking in the world. And so we leave Freya in her wanderings, knowing that she continues her work in every moment, in every world, for all time. She is there when we need her, whether we know her name or not. She is the feeling of peace that comes unbidden. She is the unexpected beauty that catches our breath. She is the comfort that eases our pain. She is the hope that sustains us through darkness. May her blessings be upon all who hear this tale. May her peace be in your heart. May her beauty fill your eyes. May her love surround you like a warm cloak on a cold night. May you rest well and wake refreshed, carrying with you something of the goddess's eternal kindness. And may you always remember that you too are part of the great web of existence, precious and valued, loved beyond measure. You too are a thread in the tapestry of being, and your presence makes the pattern more complete. Rest now in this knowing. Let it ease you into peaceful sleep. Let it carry you gently through the night. Let it bring you safely to morning, where new beauty awaits. Through the changing seasons, Freya continued her patient work across all the realms. When winter came to Midgard, covering the land in blankets of snow, she would walk through the frozen landscapes and see beauty in the starkness. The bare trees standing against gray skies held their own particular grace. The ice that formed on ponds and streams created patterns of such delicate complexity that even the finest craftsperson could not replicate them. The silence that snow brought to the world was its own kind of music. In winter, Freya would visit the homes where families gathered close around fires, seeking warmth and companionship in the dark month. She would watch as they told stories to pass the long evenings, as they worked on crafts and mended tools, as they planned for the spring that would eventually come. She saw how winter forced people to slow down, to turn inward, to live more simply. She understood that this too was necessary, this time of rest and reflection. The goddess would bless the stores of food that families had put aside for winter. She would ensure that grain stayed dry and free of mold, that preserved vegetables remained good to eat, that salted meat did not spoil. She could not prevent hunger entirely, for some winters were harder than others, and some harvests failed despite all effort. But she could ease the burden where possible, stretching supplies a little further, making nutrition go a little deeper into hungry bodies. Freya also cared for the animals during winter's hardship. She would guide deer to places where they could paw through snow to reach dried grass beneath. She would show birds where seeds and berries still clung to plants, hidden food sources they might have missed. She would lead wolves to prey when hunting grew too difficult, ensuring they could feed their packs. Every creature deserved to survive, and Freya did what she could to tip the balance toward life. In the deepest part of winter, when the sun barely rose above the horizon and darkness claimed most of each day, Freya would bring light in other ways. She would appear in dreams more frequently, giving people visions of spring to remind them that winter was temporary. She would inspire them to create beauty even in the cold months, to carve wood or weave cloth, or sing songs that celebrated life, despite the harshness outside their doors. The goddess particularly loved the winter festivals that humans held, celebrations of light in the darkest time. She would watch as they lit candles and built bonfires, as they feasted and made music together. These gatherings showed the strength of community, how people could sustain each other through difficulty. She saw how shared celebration lifted spirits, how laughter pushed back against the weight of winter, how hope persisted even when the world seemed frozen and dead. When spring finally arrived, Freya would feel it before anyone else. She would sense the first stirring of sap in tree roots, still buried under snow. She would feel the first seeds beginning to wake in the earth, responding to subtle changes in temperature and light. She would know when the first birds began their journeys back from southern lands, called home by instinct older than memory. Spring was her favorite season, the time of renewal and return, of life asserting itself once more. The goddess would travel across Midgard in early spring, blessing the awakening land. She would touch trees and encourage their buds to swell and open. She would whisper to flowers sleeping in the soil, telling them it was safe to emerge. She would guide the first bees to the first blossoms, ensuring that the ancient partnership between insect and flower could begin again. Every small act of awakening received her attention and care. As spring progressed, Freya would watch with satisfaction as the world transformed. Brown and gray gave way to every shade of green. Silence gave way to birdsong. The harsh lines of winter softened into the gentle curves of new growth. Everywhere life was asserting itself, pushing up through soil, unfurling in sunlight, spreading and growing and celebrating existence. This was the world as it should be, Freya thought, always renewing itself, always beginning again. The spring planting was a sacred time to Freya. She would visit every field as farmers prepared the soil and sowed their seed. She would bless each handful of grain as it was scattered, each furrow as it was open to receive seeds. She understood the faith required for planting, the trust that tiny seeds would become food enough to sustain families and communities. She honored that faith by ensuring it was not misplaced, by helping seeds sprout strong and grow true. During spring planting, Freya would often make herself visible to those who worked the land, appearing as a woman in simple clothes who stopped to help for a while. She would work alongside farmers, her divine hands pushing seeds into earth, just like mortal hands. She would speak with them about their hopes and concerns, about weather patterns and soil conditions, about family matters and community news. These conversations nourished her as much as her blessings nourished the seeds. The farmers never quite realized who had worked beside them. They would remember a helpful stranger who appeared and then moved on. They might notice that the rows she helped with seemed to grow more vigorously than other rows, but they would attribute this to chance or to particularly good soil in that section. Freya preferred it this way. She did not need recognition or worship. The work itself was the reward, the satisfaction of helping life flourish. As spring turned toward summer, the goddess would watch the crops growing with the careful attention of a master gardener. She would notice which fields were struggling and which were thriving. She would bring gentle rains when the earth grew too dry, but never so much rain that it would damage tender plants or wash away soil. She would moderate temperatures when possible, preventing late frosts that could kill young shoots or heat waves that could stress plants beyond recovery. Summer was a time of abundance and growth, when the work of spring showed its results. Fields filled with growing grain that rippled in the breeze like waves on a green sea. Vegetable gardens burst with produce faster than families could consume it. Fruit trees hung heavy with ripening apples and pears and cherries. Everywhere, there was more than enough, a generosity from the earth that moved Freya deeply every time she witnessed it. The goddess loved summer evenings most of all, when the heat of the day released its grip and coolness rose from the earth. She would watch as families gathered outside their homes, too warm to stay indoors, sitting together in the long twilight. Children would play until darkness finally forced them inside. Adults would talk quietly, their voices a gentle murmur beneath the sounds of crickets and nightbirds. These peaceful scenes represented everything Freya valued. People together, trouble set aside for a while, simple contentment in being alive. In summer, Freya would also spend time in the wild places that humans did not cultivate. She would walk through meadows thick with wildflowers, each bloom a small miracle of color and form. She would wade through streams where fish darted between rocks and dragonflies hovered over the water. She would climb to mountain meadows where alpine flowers grew in the brief summer, making the most of their short season. Every wild thing had its own beauty, its own way of being perfect. The goddess understood that wild places were as important as cultivated fields. They provided homes for countless creatures. They were refuges for plants and animals that could not adapt to human presence. They reminded people that the world was larger than their farms and villages, that mystery and wonder still existed beyond the borders of the known. Freya protected wild places fiercely, turning aside those who would damage them without good reason. She would sometimes guide hunters into these wild places, but only hunters who took what they needed and no more, who thanked their prey for the sacrifice of its life, who used every part of the animal with respect and care. These hunters understood themselves as part of nature rather than separate from it. They knew that taking a life was a serious matter, never to be done carelessly or for sport. Freya approved of such hunters and would ensure their hunts were successful. But hunters who killed for pleasure, who took more than they needed, who wasted what they killed or caused unnecessary suffering, these hunters found that prey eluded them. Their arrows would miss marks they should have hit. Animals would sense them coming and disappear into the forest. They would return home empty-handed, frustrated, and confused. Some would eventually understand that their approach was wrong and would change their ways. Others would give up hunting. Either way, the unnecessary killing would stop. As summer reached its peak, and then began its slow decline toward autumn, Freya would sense the changing energy of the growing season. Plants that had been focused on growth now turned their attention to reproduction. Flowers formed seeds. Fruits ripened and fell. Everything was preparing for the next generation, ensuring that life would continue beyond the individual. This eternal cycle of birth and death and rebirth was the fundamental pattern of existence, and Freya honored it in all its expressions. Autumn brought the harvest, the culmination of all the year's work. Freya would be everywhere at once during harvest time, or so it seemed to those who worked the fields. They would feel a presence with them as they cut grain and gathered vegetables and picked fruit. They would sense that their work was witnessed and valued. They would feel gratitude flowing through them, thanksgiving for the earth's gifts, and for their own ability to work and provide for their families. The harvest festivals were joyous occasions that Freya never missed. She would move invisible among the celebrating people, delighting in their happiness. She would watch as they feasted on the best of what they had grown and made. She would listen to their music and watch their dances. She would see young people courting, old people remembering past harvests, children playing with the abundance of a successful season. These festivals showed humans at their best, generous and grateful and full of life. But Freya also knew that not all harvests were good, but some years the earth gave less despite everyone's best effort. In these lean years, she worked even harder to help communities survive. She would inspire generosity in those who had more, moving them to share with those who had less. She would ensure that even small harvests provided more nutrition than expected. She would help people discover forgotten stores of food or unexpected sources of sustenance. No one under her care would starve if she could prevent it. The goddess also understood that hunger was not always a matter of insufficient food, but sometimes of poor distribution. She saw how some accumulated wealth while others went without. She saw how power and resources flowed to those who already had plenty while those in need were overlooked. This troubled her greatly, for it violated her sense of justice and fairness. She worked against such inequality in whatever way she could, though changing human systems was more difficult than changing weather or helping plants grow. Freya would appear in the dreams of those who hoarded resources, showing them visions of suffering their greed caused. She would fill them with uncomfortable feelings that disrupted their peace until they chose to be more generous. She would arrange circumstances so that selfish people encountered those in need face to face, making it harder to ignore or dismiss the suffering of others. She believed that most people were capable of kindness if they could see clearly what their choices meant for others. The goddess also inspired the creation of systems and traditions that shared resources more fairly. She would plant ideas in the minds of community leaders about storing grain collectively to protect against famine. She would encourage the development of customs where the wealthy were expected to host feasts for entire communities. She would strengthen traditions of hospitality that required people to feed and shelter travelers regardless of their ability to pay. Small changes could have large effects over time. As autumn deepened and winter approached once more, Freya would help the world prepare for sleep. She would watch as leaves changed color, putting on a final display of beauty before falling. She understood that this dying was not an ending but a transformation. The leaves would become soil, nourishing the roots of the trees that had grown them. Nothing was wasted in nature. Everything served a purpose, even in death. The goddess would guide animals as they prepared for winter. She would lead bears to good den sites where they could sleep safely through the cold months. She would show squirrels and other creatures where to store food for later. She would help birds gather in flocks for their long migrations south. She would give bees the instinct to cluster together in their hives, sharing warmth to survive until spring. Every creature needed different preparations, and Freya knew them all. In the Vanir tradition from which Freya came, there was deep wisdom about cycles and seasons, about growth and rest, about the importance of working with natural rhythms rather than against them. The Vanir understood that pushing too hard, trying to force constant growth and production, would eventually exhaust the land and the people. There must be times of rest, fallow periods when the earth recovered its strength and people recovered theirs. This wisdom was something Freya tried to teach whenever she could. She would inspire farmers to let fields rest every few years, to plant crops that renewed soil rather than depleted it. She would encourage communities to observe times of rest, to have festivals and holy days when no work was done and people could simply be together. She would remind everyone through dreams and subtle influences that rest was not laziness but necessity, that renewal required release. The goddess herself practiced what she taught. Despite her endless duties and her care for countless beings, she also took time for rest and restoration. She would spend days in her hall doing nothing but existing in peace. She would sit in her gardens and simply observe without any agenda. She would fly in her falcon form with no destination in mind, flying purely for the joy of flight. These periods of rest made her more effective when she returned to her work. Freya also spent time with her daughters when they were all in the same realm. Nos and Gerzemi had grown into goddesses of great power and beauty in their own right, but they still sought their mother's company and wisdom. The three of them would walk together through Folkvangri, talking about everything and nothing. They would share observations about the worlds they had visited, stories of beings they had encountered, questions about the nature of existence. These conversations between mother and daughters were precious to all of them. Freya learned from her daughters as much as they learned from her. They saw things from different perspectives, noticed details she had missed, had insights that surprised and delighted her. She was proud of who they had become, these beings she had guided from their first moments of existence. They were fully themselves, distinct from her while also carrying forward the values and wisdom she had shared. Sometimes the three goddesses would work together on projects that required combined power. They might create a particularly blessed place in Midgard, a grove or spring or hill that would remain sacred and healing for ages. They might intervene together in a situation too complex for any one of them to address alone. They might simply combine their magic to create something beautiful, a display of northern lights that would take human breath away, a dawn of such perfect color and clarity that those who witnessed it would remember it all their lives. The bond between Freya and her daughters reflected the bonds she wished for all families. She believed that parents should nurture children into independence, supporting them as they discovered their own paths, rather than forcing them to follow predetermined routes. She believed that families should remain connected through love rather than obligation, that adult children and parents could be friends as well as relation. She modeled these beliefs in her relationship with Nos and Gersemi. The goddess also maintained relationships with others of the Vanir, her original clan. Though she lived much of her time in Asgard among the Aesir, after the joining of the two groups of gods, she never forgot her root. She would return regularly to the realms where the Vanir made their homes, visiting siblings and cousins, sharing news and magic, maintaining the connections that had shaped her. The Vanir were different from the Aesir in fundamental ways. They were older, connected to forces that existed before the current ordering of the world. They understood magic that the Aesir had to learn, wisdom that came from deep time rather than from conquest or clever thinking. They were patient in ways that the more active and aggressive Aesir sometimes struggled to understand. They knew how to wait, how to work with slow processes, how to trust in natural rhythms. Freya embodied these Vanir qualities, while also adopting some Aesir characteristics. She could be fierce when necessary, could fight to protect what she loved. She could make quick decisions and take bold action. But her foundation remained Vanir, rooted in the deep magic of earth and growth, in the patient accumulation of power through understanding rather than force. This combination made her uniquely valuable to both groups of gods. When conflicts arose between the Vanir and Aesir, which still happened occasionally despite their alliance, Freya often served as mediator. She understood both perspectives, could speak both languages literally and figuratively. She could explain Vanir patience to impatient Aesir, and could explain Aesir urgency to Vanir who sometimes moved too slowly. She helped both groups see value in different approaches, understand that multiple ways of being could coexist. Goddess also worked to maintain balance between the various realms and forces. She understood that existence required both order and chaos, both creation and destruction, both growth and decay. Too much of any one force would unbalance everything. The gods of order needed to be balanced by giants of chaos. Life needed to be balanced by death. Light needed to be balanced by dark. Freya worked to maintain these balances, subtle adjustments that kept everything functioning. This work of balance often went unnoticed, because it was precisely the lack of dramatic problems that indicated success. When harvests were adequate but not excessive, when conflicts ended without too much damage, when changes happened gradually rather than catastrophically, this was often Freya's influence at work. She preferred quiet success to dramatic intervention, small corrections to large disruptions. The goddess spent considerable time and energy preventing problems before they occurred, rather than fixing them afterward. She would sense tensions building and work to release them before they exploded into violence. She would notice systems beginning to fail and shore them up before collapse. She would see patterns leading toward disaster and gently alter them toward better outcomes. Prevention was harder than cure because success was invisible, but Freya practiced it faithfully. In all her work across all the realms, Freya maintained an attitude of service rather than dominant. She did not help others because she was superior, and they were inferior. She helped because she had abilities that could ease suffering and increase well-being, and it seemed obvious to her that such abilities should be used for those purposes. She was powerful, but she wore her power lightly, never using it to impress or intimidate, only to assist and protect. This humility was unusual among the divine. Many gods viewed their power as proof of their superiority over mortals and lesser beings. They expected worship and sacrifice, demanded obedience, punished any perceived disrespect. But Freya asked for none of these things. She gave her blessings freely, without requiring payment or tribute. She helped those who called on her and those who did not know her name. She served without expectation of recognition or reward. Those who did worship Freya found their devotion met with gentle encouragement rather than demands for more. She would accept offerings left at her shrines, simple gifts of honey or flowers or woven cloth. She would listen to prayers and help when she could. But she also encouraged her followers to trust themselves, to develop their own wisdom and magic, to become more rather than remaining dependent on divine intervention. The goddess particularly encouraged women who felt called to her service. She taught them magic and healing, helped them develop their intuition and their connection to natural rhythms. She showed them how to work with plants and elements, how to read omens and interpret dreams, how to guide others through life transition. These women became priestesses in a sense, though Freya did not use that term. They were simply wise women, healers, helpers who carried forward her work in human form. Through these women, Freya's influence spread more widely than she could reach alone. Each wise woman could help many people, could teach many others, could plant seeds of wisdom that would grow for generations. This was another form of multiplication, the way small actions could cascade into large effects. One woman learning to heal could save dozens of lives. One woman teaching others could create a tradition that lasted centuries. Freya invested heavily in these teachers and healers. The goddess also recognized and supported men who carried similar callings. Healers and wise ones came in all forms, and Freya welcomed all who genuinely sought to help others. She did not limit her blessings by gender or any other characteristic. What mattered was the heart, the intention, the willingness to serve. Those qualities could be found anywhere, in anyone, and Freya responded to them wherever she found them. In the eternal now, where Freya existed, time moved differently than it did for mortals. She could experience the entire life of a tree from seed to ancient death in a single moment of attention. She could follow a bloodline forward through generations, seeing how choices made by ancestors affected descendants who would live centuries later. She could trace the ripples of a single act of kindness or cruelty as they spread through communities and across lifetimes. This perspective gave her patience and also urgency, understanding both that everything mattered and that individual moments were part of vast patterns. The goddess saw clearly that present actions created future realities. The seeds planted today would become the forests of tomorrow. The children taught today would become the leaders of the next generation. The habits formed today would shape cultures for centuries. This meant that current choices carried tremendous weight, that nothing was truly small or insignificant. Every action was a seed, and Freya tried to help people plant seeds that would grow into beauty rather than ugliness. But she also saw that mistakes were not permanent, that harmful patterns could be broken, that redemption was always possible. A person who had caused hurt could choose differently going forward. A community caught in cycles of violence could find paths to peace. Even seemingly irredeemable situations contained possibilities for transformation, if people were willing to see them and work toward them. Freya never gave up on anyone or anything, always believing in the possibility of change for the better. This belief in redemption made Freya merciful in her judgment. When souls arrived in her hall, carrying guilt for things they had done in life, she would listen to their confessions with compassion. She would help them understand the roots of their harmful actions, the hurt and fear that had driven them to hurt others. She would show them how to forgive themselves, which was often harder than earning forgiveness from others. She would teach them that acknowledging harm and genuinely changing was more important than punishing themselves forever. The goddess understood that shame and guilt, if held too tightly, prevented growth rather than encouraging it. People paralyzed by shame could not move forward. They became stuck in endless self-recrimination that served no one. Freya worked to free people from this paralysis, helping them accept that they had done harm while also accepting that they could do better. Both truths needed to be held simultaneously, neither denying the past nor being imprisoned by it. In her hall, souls learned that healing was a process, not an event. They could not simply decide to be healed and have it be so. They had to sit with their pain, understand it, process it, integrate it. They had to forgive themselves and accept forgiveness from others. They had to practice new ways of being until those ways became natural. All of this took time, even in eternity, but Freya gave them all the time they needed. There was no rush in Folkvanga, no pressure to heal faster than was natural. The goddess would walk among the healing souls, offering comfort and encouragement. She would sit with those who wept, holding space for their grief without trying to stop it or hurry it along. She would celebrate small victories with those who achieved breakthroughs in their understanding. She would offer wisdom when asked, but also knew when to remain silent and simply present. Her presence itself was healing, a reminder that they were loved and valued despite their past mistakes. As ages passed and the world continued its endless turning, Freya remained constant in her care. Empires rose and fell, languages were born and died, entire peoples migrated across continents or disappeared entirely, but the goddess continued her work. She blessed the fields regardless of who farmed them. She comforted the grieving regardless of what they called their sorrow. She inspired beauty wherever conscious beings existed to create it. Her love was not conditional on culture or creed, on worthiness or virtue. It simply was, as constant as the turning of the earth. The goddess had witnessed the very first humans come into being, had watched them learn to walk upright and use tools and speak in word. She had been present when they discovered fire and learned to cook their food. She had observed as they developed agriculture, shifting from hunting and gathering to planting and harvesting. Each of these changes had been momentous, transforming what it meant to be human, and through all of them, Freya had offered her quiet guidance and support. In those early days, humans lived very close to the natural world. They understood themselves as part of nature rather than separate from it. They knew which plants healed and which ones harmed. They could read weather in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. They respected the spirits they sensed in trees and stones and streams. This closeness to nature made them more receptive to Freya's presence, more able to sense her blessings and heed her gentle suggestions. As human societies grew more complex, developing cities and governments and specialized roles, some of this connection was lost. People who spent their days in markets and workshops gradually forgot how to read the land. People who bought their food from others lost understanding of how it grew. People who lived surrounded by stone walls stopped noticing the changing seasons. This saddened Freya, though she understood it was a natural consequence of the path humanity had chosen. But even in the largest cities, the goddess found ways to maintain connection. She would inspire the creation of gardens within city walls, green spaces where nature could still be encountered. She would ensure that trees lined streets, providing shade and beauty and homes for birds. She would bring flowers to bloom in window boxes and courtyard. She would send the scent of growing things on the wind, subtle reminders of the world beyond the stone and wood of human construction. Freya also worked through the cycles of human life, the transitions that every person experienced. She was present at births, as already told, but she also attended coming-of-age ceremonies, weddings, and death. Each of these moments was a threshold, a crossing from one state of being to another. Thresholds were places of power and vulnerability, and Freya made sure that those crossing them received whatever support and blessing she could provide. When young people came of age, stepping into adult responsibilities, Freya would bless them with clarity about their gifts and calling. She would help them see their own strengths and understand how those strengths could serve their communities. She would give them courage to follow their own paths, even when those paths differed from what parents or society expected. She believed every person had unique purposes to fulfill, and she worked to help them discover and embrace those purposes. At weddings, Freya would bless the joining of two people with love and patience. She knew that human love was complex, that it required work and compromise and the willingness to grow together. She could not make relationships easy, but she could give couples the resources they needed to build lasting partnership. She would strengthen their affection for each other, deepen their capacity to forgive and be forgiven, help them remember why they had chosen each other during times of conflict and difficulty. The goddess understood that not all marriages were happy, that some unions caused more harm than good. In cases where one partner dominated or hurt the other, where violence or cruelty replaced love, Freya would work to free the trapped partner. She would give them courage to leave, would arrange circumstances that made escape possible, would ensure they had somewhere safe to go. She believed firmly that no one should be forced to remain in situations that destroyed them, regardless of social expectations or religious rule. At deaths, Freya served as gentle guide and comforter. She would be present as people took their final breaths, ensuring they were not alone in that last moment. She would ease their transition, making the passage from life to death as peaceful as possible. For those who died in pain or fear, she would replace those feelings with peace and acceptance. For those who died with unfinished business or unspoken words, she would carry those messages to the living through dreams and subtle signs. The goddess also comforted those left behind by death. She understood that grief was a necessary process, not something to be rushed or avoided. She would sit invisible beside the grieving, offering silent support. She would bring them dreams of their lost loved ones, not to prevent grief, but to remind them that love persisted beyond death. She would help them gradually adjust to absence, to build lives that honored what was lost while still embracing what remained. Freya had learned much about grief from her own experience of losing OD. She knew that grief never completely ended, that it simply changed over time. The sharp pain of fresh loss gradually transformed into a duller ache, and eventually into something gentler still, a bittersweet remembering. But the love that caused the grief never died. It remained a permanent part of the one who grieved. This knowledge made Freya patient with the grieving process in others. She never told anyone to move on or get over their loss. She simply held space for whatever they needed to feel. The goddess also understood complicated grief, the kind that arose when relationships had been difficult or when death came in traumatic ways. Some people grieved those who had hurt them, torn between relief and sorrow. Some grieved losses that society did not recognize or validate. Some carried grief mixed with guilt, wondering if they could have done something to prevent the death. All of these complicated feelings received Freya's gentle acceptance. She did not judge how people grieved, only offered support through however grief manifested. In her wanderings through Midgard, Freya often visited places where humans gathered to honor their dead. She would walk through burial grounds and memorial sites, sensing the love and sorrow that had been poured into these spaces. She would read the markers people left, the stones carved with names and dates, the flowers laid on graves, the small personal objects placed to honor the departed. Each of these gestures touched her deeply, evidence of love's persistence beyond the boundary of death. The goddess would bless these memorial places, keeping them peaceful and helping them serve their purpose of providing comfort to the living. She would ensure that flowers grew wild on old graves, that no one visited anymore, so that even the forgotten dead had beauty around them. She would bring peace to places where violent deaths had occurred, transforming sites of trauma into spaces where healing could happen. She believed that the dead deserved honor and that the living deserved peace, and she worked to provide both. Freya also maintained awareness of the spirits of the dead who had not gone to any afterlife realm, but remained somehow between worlds. These were souls who could not let go of life, who stayed attached to familiar places or unfinished purposes. Sometimes they remained by choice, unwilling to leave people or places they loved. Other times they were confused, not fully understanding that they had died. Still others were trapped by intense emotions, by rage or guilt or desperate longing that bound them to the physical world. The goddess would visit these lingering spirits and offer them counsel. She would explain their situation gently, helping confused souls understand what had happened to them. She would offer trapped souls release from the emotions binding them, showing them how to let go. She would give choosing souls blessing to remain if they wished, but also clear description of what awaited them in the afterlife realms. Most spirits, once they fully understood their options, chose to move on. But Freya respected those who decided to stay, asking only that they cause no harm to the living. Some spirits remained to serve as guardians of places or people they had loved in life. These were gentle presences, protective rather than frightening. A grandmother's spirit might watch over her descendants, appearing in dreams to offer advice during difficult times. A warrior spirit might guard a village against threats. A healer's spirit might inspire living healers with knowledge they had accumulated over a lifetime. These helpful spirits earned Freya's gratitude and support. She would strengthen their ability to help while ensuring they did not become bound by their service. The goddess also dealt with more troublesome spirits, those whose attachment to the physical world caused problems for the living. Angry ghosts who frightened people or caused physical disturbances required gentle but firm handling. Freya would confront them with compassion, acknowledging their pain while also setting boundaries. She would help them understand that their anger hurt themselves more than anyone else, that continuing to rage changed nothing. Most could be persuaded to release their anger and move on to healing. Those who refused were bound by Freya's magic, prevented from causing further harm while still given opportunities to change their choices. In all her work with the dead and dying, Freya maintained deep respect for the mystery of death. She knew more than mortals about what lay beyond life, but even she did not know everything. Death remained a threshold that each being had to cross alone, a transition that could not be fully explained to those who had not experienced it. Freya honored this mystery, never pretending to have all answers, always acknowledging that some questions could only be answered through direct experience. The goddess spent considerable time in places of learning, the schools and workshops, where knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. She understood that education was sacred work, that teaching and learning were forms of magic in their own right. A good teacher could transform a life, could unlock potential that would otherwise remain dormant. A good student could carry forward wisdom, preventing knowledge from being lost when the teacher died. Freya would bless teachers with patience and insight. She would help them understand each student's unique way of learning, the particular approach that would help knowledge take root in that specific mind. She would give them energy for the demanding work of teaching, the constant giving of attention and care that good education required. She would remind them during frustrating times why their work mattered, how even small progress in a student represented victory worth celebrating. The goddess also blessed students with curiosity and retention. She would spark their interest in subjects that could serve them well. She would help them remember what they learned, moving information from temporary attention into permanent understanding. She would give them persistence to continue studying even when learning was difficult. She would help them see connections between different areas of knowledge, understanding how everything related to everything else. Freya particularly supported the education of girls and women, for she knew that many societies limited what females were allowed to learn. She would inspire some families to teach their daughters as well as their sons. She would ensure that women with sharp minds found ways to pursue knowledge despite obstacles. She would help wise women pass their learning to the next generation of healers and midwives and counselors. She believed that denying education to half of humanity weakened everyone, that the full flourishing of society required all people to develop their gifts. The goddess also valued practical education as much as book learning. The farmer who understood soil and weather, the craftsperson who mastered their tools, the cook who knew how to bring out the best in simple ingredients. These people possessed wisdom as real as any scholar. Freya honored all forms of knowledge and skill. She blessed the hands that learned to do things well, whether those hands held pens or plows, needles or hammers, or any of the countless tools humans had invented to shape their world. In her travels, Freya would sometimes encounter people practicing arts that required years to master. A weaver might spend a lifetime perfecting her technique, creating cloth so fine and beautiful it seemed impossible. A potter might throw hundreds of vessels before achieving the perfect form he envisioned. A musician might practice scales and exercises for decades before her fingers could express exactly what her heart felt. These people understood dedication and patience, and Freya admired them greatly. The goddess would support these master practitioners in subtle ways. She would give them moments of inspiration when they felt stuck. She would help them push through frustrations that made them want to quit. She would send them students who truly appreciated their art and would carry it forward. She would ensure that their best work found its way to people who would treasure it. She believed that mastery deserved recognition and support, that those who dedicated their lives to excellence in any field honored existence itself through their commitment. Freya also understood the dark side of mastery, the way pursuit of perfection could become obsessive and destructive. Some people sacrificed everything to their craft, neglecting family and health and all other aspects of life. Some became so critical that nothing they made satisfied them, their standards so high they could never meet them. Some grew arrogant, believing their skill made them superior to others. The goddess worked to help these people find balance, to remember that craft was meant to serve life rather than replace it. The changing of the guard between generations was another cycle that fascinated Freya. She would watch as young people full of new ideas and energy came of age, sometimes clashing with elders who held to traditional ways. She saw value in both the innovation of youth and the wisdom of age. The challenge was helping both groups respect each other, learn from each other, and work together rather than in opposition. Freya would inspire elders to remain open to new ideas, to remember that they too had once been young and eager to change things. She would help them see which traditions needed to be preserved and which ones could be adapted or released. She would give them patience with young people's mistakes, remembering their own youthful errors. She would remind them that their role was to guide and advise, not to control and constrain. The goddess also counseled young people to listen to their elders, to learn from accumulated experience before dismissing it as outdated. She would help them understand that not all old ways were bad, simply because they were old, that some traditions contained important wisdom. She would teach them to distinguish between necessary change and change for its own sake. She would give them respect for those who had worked and sacrificed to create the world they inherited. In communities where generations worked together harmoniously, combining the energy and innovation of youth with the wisdom and experience of age, wonderful things could happen. These communities adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining core values. They honored the past while embracing the future. They gave everyone roles that matched their abilities and life stages. Freya blessed such communities with prosperity and peace, held them up as examples of how humans could organize themselves well. The goddess also paid attention to those who lived at the margins of society, people who did not fit neatly into standard categories and roles. The wanderers and hermits, the eccentrics and visionaries, the people whose minds worked differently or whose bodies did not match common patterns. Society often rejected or feared such people, but Freya saw value in different. She understood that those who stood outside normal categories often saw things that others missed, had insights that could not emerge from conventional thinking. Freya would protect these marginal people from the worst persecution. She would inspire some community members to show kindness and acceptance. She would ensure that outsiders found enough support to survive, even when they were not welcomed into the social mainstream. She would help some of them find each other, building communities of outsiders who could support and understand one another. She believed that diversity made existence richer, that different perspectives and ways of being enhanced rather than threatened the whole. Some of these outsiders became prophets and visionaries, people who could see futures that others could not imagine. They spoke truths that made people uncomfortable, challenged assumptions that everyone else accepted without question. Society often rejected their messages, sometimes violently, but Freya protected them as best she could, understanding that prophets served important functions even when their words were unwelcome. They reminded everyone that current arrangements were not inevitable, that other ways of living were possible, that change was always an option. The goddess also worked with dreams more extensively than has yet been described. Every night, millions of beings slept and dreamed, and Freya maintained awareness of all those dreams simultaneously. She could not intervene in all of them individually, but she maintained a general presence, a background blessing that made dreams more restful and meaningful. She helped people process their experiences through dreams, working through conflicts and fears in the safe space of sleep. Some dreams were messages that needed to be delivered. Freya would carry communications from the dead to the living, from gods to mortals, from one person's deep self to their conscious mind. She would translate these messages into the symbolic language of dreams, encoding important information in images and narratives that the conscious mind could unpack after waking. Many people received guidance and warning through dreams without ever knowing that a goddess had served as messenger. Other dreams were simply release, ways for the mind to discharge the tensions and stresses of waking life. In these dreams, impossible things could happen without consequence. Frustrations could be expressed safely. Fears could be confronted in cute ways. The dreaming mind had wisdom of its own, and Freya respected it, intervening only when dreams turned toward genuine nightmare, or when the dreamer specifically called for help. The goddess would sometimes send dreams to large groups of people, simultaneously, planting ideas that could shift entire cultures. A dream about sharing resources more fairly might come to hundreds of people in a region, and some of them would wake and begin discussing the idea, and gradually it would take hold and change how the community operated. A dream about a new way of growing food might inspire innovations that increased yields and reduced hunger. A dream about peace might soften hearts hardened by cycles of violence. These collective dreams were subtle forms of intervention, respecting human free will while still offering guidance. People could always ignore or reject the dreams. They could wake and dismiss them as meaningless. But for those who paid attention, who sensed that their dreams carried importance, the messages could catalyze real change. Freya trusted humans to know which dreams meant something and which were just random mental noise. The goddess also used dreams to teach magic to those with the gift for it. A person born with natural sensitivity to the unseen realms might receive dream lessons from Freya, learning techniques for working with energy and intention. They would wake with knowledge they had not possessed before, practical understanding of how to heal or protect or transform. These dream students became wise ones in their communities, healers and advisors who served others with gifts they had received from the goddess. In addition to her work with individuals and communities, Freya maintained relationships with the land itself. Every forest and mountain, every river and lake had its own spirit, its own awareness. These were not like human consciousness, but were real nonetheless. The spirit of a forest encompassed all the trees and plants and animals and fungi and soil organisms. The entire ecosystem expressing itself as a unified being. The spirit of a mountain was the stone itself, ancient beyond human comprehension, patient beyond human capacity. Freya spoke with these land spirits regularly. She would ask forests how they were faring, whether they needed anything from her. She would listen to mountains speak of the slow processes that shaped them, the grinding of tectonic plates, and the patience of erosion. She would hear rivers sing their songs of flowing, the joy of movement from high places to the sea. She would feel the contentment of healthy lakes, ecosystems in balance, or the distress of polluted waters where balance had been broken. When land spirits was suffering, Freya would work to address the causes. If logging was damaging a forest faster than it could recover, she would try to slow the cutting or inspire people to plant new trees. If a river was being polluted by human activities, she would work to change those activities, or at least minimize the damage. If a mountain was being mined too aggressively, threatening its structural integrity, she would cause collapses or difficulties that would discourage further excavation. The goddess understood that humans needed resources from the land to survive. She did not oppose all logging or mining or farming, but she believed in sustainable use, in taking no more than could be regenerated, in respecting the rights of the land itself. When humans worked in partnership with nature, rather than opposition to it, everyone benefited. When they took without giving back, when they damaged beyond recovery, when they prioritized short-term gain over long-term health, problems inevitably followed. Freya tried to teach humans these principles of sustainability and respect. She would inspire some people to see the land differently, to understand that soil and water and forests were not infinite resources to be exploited, but living partners to be honored. She would give them visions of what their lands could become if properly cared for, or what deserts and wastelands would result from continued abuse. She hoped that understanding consequences would change behavior. Some people heard these messages and changed how they related to the land. They became stewards rather than exploiters, guardians rather than conquerors. They worked with natural systems instead of against them. They took responsibility for healing damage their predecessors had caused. These people were precious to Freya, proof that humans could live in harmony with the world that sustained them. She blessed them richly and held them up as examples to others. But other people remained deaf to all warnings. They saw only immediate profit and personal gain. They rationalized damage as necessary for progress. They convinced themselves that the land existed solely for human use. These people frustrated and saddened Freya, but she could not force them to see differently. All she could do was limit the worst damage and continue trying to reach them through dreams and subtle influences. The goddess also worked with weather patterns, though she was not the primary deity responsible for weather. She could not create storms or sunshine at will, but she could make small adjustments that had significant effect. A slight shift in wind direction might bring rain to parched fields. A small temperature change might prevent a killing frost. These minor alterations required careful calculation to avoid unintended consequences. But Freya had millennia of experience to draw upon. She particularly focused on preventing weather extremes that would cause unnecessary suffering. A storm growing too powerful might be slightly weakened before it struck inhabited areas. A drought extending too long might be broken with carefully timed rain. A winter turning too harsh might be slightly moderated to prevent mass starvation. Freya could not prevent all weather-related disasters, but she could reduce their frequency and severity. The goddess also paid attention to the slow changes in global climate that occurred over longer timescale. She watched ice ages advance and retreat, sea levels rise and fall, deserts form, and forests spread. These large changes were beyond her power to stop, part of natural cycles built into the world's structure. But she could help creatures adapt to changing conditions, guiding migrations and evolutionary developments that allowed life to persist through transformations. Through all of these various forms of care and intervention, Freya maintained her fundamental commitment to love as the guiding principle. Love was not merely emotion but action, not merely feeling but choice. Love meant wanting the best for others and working to bring that about. Love meant sacrifice and service, patience and persistence. Love meant seeing value in all beings and treating them accordingly. This was Freya's teaching and her practice, the core of everything she did. The goddess knew that love was often misunderstood. Some people confused love with indulgence, thinking that loving someone meant never setting boundaries or allowing consequences. Others confused love with control, thinking that loving someone meant directing their choices. Still others confused love with dependency, thinking that being loved meant being taken care of rather than being supported and growing stronger. Freya worked patiently to teach clearer understanding of what love truly meant. Real love, Freya taught, respected the freedom and dignity of the beloved. It supported growth rather than preventing it. It allowed mistakes because mistakes were how learning happened. It set boundaries when necessary because boundaries protected well-being. It told truth even when truth was uncomfortable because truth served better than comfortable lies. It stayed present through difficulty rather than disappearing when things got hard. It celebrated the beloved's successes without jealousy. It honored the beloved's journey even when that journey led in unexpected direction. This kind of love was difficult. It required constant self-examination and the willingness to change. It required managing one's own fears and insecurities rather than projecting them onto others. It required accepting that one could not control outcomes, that loving someone did not guarantee they would make choices you agreed with or become who you hoped they would be. It required letting go again and again, trusting that love itself was enough even when it could not prevent all pain or solve all problems. Freya embodied this mature love in all her relationships. She loved without possessing, cared without controlling, guided without forcing. She offered her gifts freely and accepted whatever response came without resentment. She continued loving even when love was not returned or appreciated. She found joy in the flourishing of others without needing credit or recognition. This was divine love, love as the gods practiced it at their best. And it set a standard that mortals could aspire to even if they could not fully achieve it. The story ends as all stories must, but the truth it tells continues forever. Freya walks still in the places between, tending her eternal gardens, singing her endless songs, loving all beings with a love that knows no bound. And in that love, all may find rest.